Weekly jobless numbers are in. 881,000 new people filed for unemployment during the last week of August. The good news is that's the lowest weekly total since the pandemic started. But what does that actually mean for our economic recovery? NBC News senior business correspondent Stephanie Ruhle joins me now. Stephanie, it's good to see you. Now, this is the second time in a month unemployment claims dip below 1 million. Tell us, are we on our way to recovery here? Is that what this means?
Savannah, it is always good to see you. I haven't seen you in such a long time, but let's be honest about this recovery.
I know.
This recovery is fragile and it's fragmented. Yes, the number has dipped below 1 million, but let's be real. We're at 4.5 times the amount of people who are unemployed today than at this point last year. You've got 29 million Americans that are currently on unemployment. And this idea that the economy is roaring back and we're snapping back, this V recovery, it's nowhere to be seen. Unemployment is barely gone down in the month of August. And what's really happening is the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. With these numbers, you practically have 1 in 5 Americans without a job. And what's really confusing is you do have the stock market roaring. You do have businesses like boat sales, vacation homes, home remodeling, through the roof with the amount of money people are spending. But then on the other end of the scale, you've got food banks. They're busting at the seams because so many people are suffering. And in the last Wall Street Journal poll, 11% of the people polled said in the last 7 days they were food insecure. So you are seeing this divide, unfortunately, only widen even further. And look at the month ahead. We're looking at airline companies that are already paving the way, saying, get ready. There's a good chance we're going to be furloughing thousands and thousands more workers. And we still don't have another economic relief plan from Congress. So when Congress comes back, I assure you there's more pressure for it. But standalone, you cannot say that anything is booming. We are in a recovery, a slow, fragile, and very fragmented recovery.
So then, Steph, while all that's going on, we do have the stock market. I won't use the word booming, but breaking records. Tell us what's behind that.
Listen, the stock market is breaking records because the big are only getting bigger. And remember, when we talk about the stock market, we're really just talking about the index. And even the index, you're looking at a disproportionate amount of those monster companies that don't need to recover. The big tech companies like an Amazon, a Google, a Facebook, the huge retailers like a Walmart. Those companies don't need to recover. They're only getting bigger. And what's really sad about it, as you're watching thousands and thousands of small businesses disappear, the demand for those businesses aren't disappearing, but people are now going to those mega giant stores. So a year from now, we could only have big box stores to choose from. We could be losing 50% of our independent restaurants. That's the track we're on. We're going to continue on that track unless something changes.
That is just a scary and sad thought. Now, Steph, you mentioned how we still don't have a new relief bill. These talks are stalled in Congress, but we've got 13 million Americans out of work. If they can't strike a deal soon, what is this going to mean for our economy?
Listen, it's really rough. And don't forget, when there is that stimulus, people are then putting that money back in the economy. They're out there buying groceries. They are going to restaurants. They are paying their rent. We're in a situation where we're facing millions of Americans who are delinquent. They're not paying their rent. They're not paying their bills. And without that money, the economy starts to stall out. You have to remember, the United States is a consumer-based economy. We're not a manufacturing economy. In China, it's about manufacturing. In the United States, it's consumers. Consumers need to spend. And if consumers aren't spending, the economy stalls out.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.